Welcome everyone, bienvenidos a todos. This is the Nuestro South podcast, Loud and Proud. Mi nombre es Axel Herrera, and I'm your host. Today we are having our closing conversation on the Poder y Cultura of Latinx folks in the South, and what it means to be Latino, Latina, Latinx, from Mississippi to Arkansas to Georgia and all the way to North Carolina. So it's a great conversation to end, and we have a special guest, Dr. Yuri Ramirez. She is a Ford Foundation Fellow and Assistant Professor of History at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Currently, she is working on her book manuscript titled Indigeneity on the Move, Transborder Politics from Michoacan to North Carolina. She's also a fellow alum from Duke University, so go Duke. She's a scholar and an organizer for immigrant communities. Welcome, Judy. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Axel, for having me.
All right, awesome. So we're going to get this conversation going with just a few quick questions to warm up a little bit and get to know who you are more on a personal level. And before we get to the big questions and big topics. So you were in Duke, which means you were in Durham, which means you're in North Carolina, my hometown. So what are a couple, or maybe just one or two Southerns, or maybe just Latino food places that were your favorites while you were here?
Híjole, Axel, that is really hard for me to choose. You're putting me on the spot with the favorite spots. I feel like I had so many different locations that were memorable to me for a lot of different reasons, but I'm going to narrow it down. So I really enjoyed La Azteca
Azteca Grill.
Restaurant. Azteca Grill. It's the one in, what is that neighborhood called?
I forget what it is, but I have a friend that's a super big fan of it. That's the only one he goes to, which I'm like, you gotta expand your range.
La Azteca Grill. Well, it's because also like the owners are my friends, both of them. Fun fact, I had my first date with my now husband there. So it was, it's like a special place in that regard. And so I really love it. And I'm really into, like, it started kind of as a hole in the wall, and then they became the restaurant that they are today. So I love stories like that. And it's a family run business, and they're from Michoacan.
Okay.
And I'm also a big fan of La Superior, to be honest, like going there on a lunch break to have like agua de piña and some tacos and the little bar with all of the different salsas was my jam. So I'm going to go with those two places.
Those are good options. Okay, so going up more to where you're from and where you grew up, where did most Latinos or Latinx families or adults that you knew work?
Where I grew up?
Yeah.
I mean, the only Latinx adults that I knew were my parents, because we grew up in rural Wisconsin, in a very small town that when we were young, probably had about 7,000 people there. And so my parents, and there were some other community members, some other Latino community members who like my parents moved with the factory from the suburbs of Chicago to Wisconsin. They worked at the factory. So the only Latinos that I ever met were coworkers of my parents, until I was at least, I don't know, like 16, 17, 18, that I started working in like a neighboring town that's more touristy. And folks there worked in like hotels and the service industry. So they worked in restaurants as cooks, usually, right? Dishwashers, things like that.
Yeah. What was the factory of?
So the factory makes, this is hard to explain, but they make like filters for big machinery and equipment. So like for semis, for tractors, for things like that. And they ship nationally and internationally. So my parents have worked there. Goodness, my dad has probably worked there for 36 years. And my mom probably for 32. Yeah. So my whole life. Yeah.
That's an insane amount of time.
Yeah.
It's always the oddest things that, you have like immigrants making. I remember family friends that we had, they like made like fire extinguishers, which is like the most random thing that I'm like, I have no clue how they would be made, but like this immigrant that was coming from whatever country made them as they're like, you know, what they sustain themselves with.
Yeah. Okay. I have no idea even how my dad got that job, but we lived, like I said, we lived in the suburbs of Chicago. So we lived right by the O'Hare International Airport. And my dad started working there even before I was, well, no, I was born, right? I was born in Oak Park. And my dad started working there, and then the company moved. And they were like, oh, if you guys want to come, let's go to Wisconsin. So my mom was like, Carlos, my dad, drinking too much with the homies from Durango. And they also didn't want us to grow up in like an apartment, like a 1-bedroom apartment, you know, and I mean, it's still the suburbs of a city. So it was a lot of movement all the time. And they come from a really small ranchito in Durango. And so they were like, let's go to a small town and raise the kids in a place where they can run around and be free and all this stuff. And that's what we did.
It's been one of those things that have come up in previous conversations that I've had during this project. And there's this kind of like reference of like, un lugar tranquilo.
Un lugar tranquilo. They really wanted that.
So it just, I had this question as well now that you touched on it. So I guess you grew up more in a somewhat rural setting. So which do you prefer now? More urban, suburban, rural?
You know, I think it changed with age. I swore I would never live in a small town like the one that I come from ever again. And then I went, you know, I did my undergrad at the University of Minnesota, and I love the Twin Cities, even if it is frigid cold and under 12 feet of snow. I still love the Twin Cities. It never felt like a city to me in the way that like Chicago does, for example. Then when I went to Durham, I was like, oh my goodness, this is the ideal, right? This is the ideal, because it's like it, you know, the triangle has all the benefits of being, you know, of what the city has, like concerts and sports and all that stuff, but you're still living in a pretty sort of mid-sized place, right? It's not huge at all. It's still drivable, it's still manageable. And it still kind of feels like a small town. So I really love Durham. And then when we moved here to the cornfields of Illinois, back to the state where I was born, I was like, you know, I actually enjoy that I can get to work in 5 to 10 minutes, or that, you know, I can get across town in 15. It turned out to be nice, especially, you know, as I think about like, you know, our future and hopefully building a family. I'm like, oh yeah, like the ease of living in a little community. And I'm telling you, it changes with every, you know, temporada de vida también, you know. It's like I'm in a whole other temporada of my life where, like, you know, I used to go out at 11 o'clock at night, and now I'm like in bed by 9:30. So it's just your life changes so much. So I feel like for now I'm totally happy to be where I am. So yeah,
that's a good place to be at. And last question, I'm curious, because you've mentioned where you were born and where you grew up. What were your friends like during grade school?
So all of my friends were white kids. Some of them were farmers, or like kids of farmers, because I actually, when we moved to Wisconsin, my parents didn't know that you had to be registered so early for school. And so my brother and I ended up going to like an even more rural school in a town that is barely incorporated. So I mean, there were like maybe, I don't know, 1,000 people in that town, or 800. I mean, it's probably been less now. It only had one main street in that little town. So a lot of my friends, like, we would go on field trips to farms and learn how to milk cows and make butter by hand. Those were our field trips as kids. But yeah, I was basically the token brown kid, right? And everyone called me Judy. No one called me Yuri. which is not very different, but they asked my dad, what's her name? And my dad was like, oh, her name is Judy. And they're like, oh, Judy, fabulous.
No.
So my name was anglicized K through 12. I was Judy. Wow. K through 12. Yeah.
You ever get the sense to like just push back, or was it just like?
Not until I got into high school, Axel, la verdad, because to be honest, I was a product of my environment, and I wished that my name was Katie or Kelly or Jennifer, right? I wanted an easier name. There were so many things that I didn't understand when I was growing up. I didn't understand why, like, when my friends would come over, they would leave crying because they were scared of my family because we were speaking in Spanish, or why we would have tamales at Thanksgiving and not just like a turkey. I wanted my family to be like everybody else,
She wanted the turkey. No,
I wanted the turkey, and I don't even like turkey, but I just wanted to be like all of my other friends, Yeah. And I mean, that included, for me, it was a real, and there was no talk of race or who I was or anything, right? So I was always like that token little brown kid amid all these white kids, right? Even when I went to college, my whole 4 years of college, I lived with white women. And I was always kind of the token friend. But, I certainly had different friends in college. I ended up living with these white women that I lived in the dorms with, right? And I had a lot of friends in Latino sororities and frats and stuff, but I still lived with white women. So I was always like that token kid. I guess I also felt very comfortable in some ways being the token kid. Mm-hmm. And I never really thought about it very much, right? I think as I got older, I realized looking around the room that like, there was like me and another kid, and that was it, that was like it. So yeah, it was an interesting way to grow up.
It's so interesting because obviously our conversation, the project of Nuestro South, mm-hmm. is, exploring this Nuestro South, right? The Latinx South and the experiences there. But in many ways, if you focus on like the rural experience of being a Latino in these rural areas, whether it's farm work, whether it's like factory labor, there's a lot of shared experiences. And now if you come to North Carolina, you'll find majority Hispanic schools in like rural areas, but that wasn't always the case. I mean, I'd even be interested in what some of these towns are becoming now, being from your area, but there's a lot of things that I hear that I'm like, that sounds familiar. And I'm sure your work with the South, you were like, yeah, I have that over there too.
Yeah, there's a lot of resonance, right? And I think, to be honest, I think that's why I initially was very drawn to the idea of studying Latinos in the South. When I moved to Durham, I was blown away by the amount of Latinos that were living there, right? And particularly like by the amount of Mexicanos, because I had grown up with this idea that the South is, a basic white, black binary. I mean, that's what I envisioned that I was moving to. And when I saw all the Mexicanos that were there, I was like, how? Why? Por qué? And it turned out that when my parents moved me down there, my dad was like, you know what? I actually have primos that live in North Carolina. And I was like, really? He's like, yeah. So we actually went to visit them. And they live in Greenville, North Carolina, mm-hmm. which is where Eastern Carolina University is. And they live in Las Afueras. They don't live in Greenville. But when I went to visit them, I met like younger cousins, distant cousins, right? That spoke, they made fun of me because I spoke with a Wisconsin accent. And I made fun of them because they spoke with a rural North Carolina accent. I was like, this is fascinating to me, right?
Yeah.
They told me about growing up in rural North Carolina. And I was like, wow, there are so many similarities of experiences here between us, even though we grew up thousands of miles away from each other. Certainly their North Carolina, Durham, even rural parts of North Carolina have changed at much faster rates in terms of Latino demographics than Wisconsin.
Yeah.
but it sort of, when I reflected on my youth and growing up, it sounded so similar to their story. And so that's kind of, I actually started interviewing folks that lived in rural North Carolina before I ever, endeavored to focus on an indigenous community.
This is wonderful because I think the conversation that we're having is literally the perfect way to close this series. Is that this history is personal. This history is political. It's economic.
Right.
But one of the best ways to encompass it is that it's not just like, what happens for a person that's like within the South, right, and growing up within it, but it's how it's perceived as well, right? So even Latinos or Latinx families who are in other areas have a perception of like what the South may be. So it's not only do you come and encounter it that you start like breaking down like, okay, there's all these nuances and stuff. So that was actually like the first, the place that I wanted to start. And you've already eloquently kind of like started talking about that relationship of like between your Latinidad and your relationship to it. For example, between you and your cousins, who did you feel was more connected to, I guess, your Latinidad, or whether it's like in Wisconsin versus like Greenville, North Carolina?
Who's more Latino?
No, who was just like more like attuned to it?
Yeah, I don't, it's interesting. And I feel like a lot of young people are like this that I've met. Not a lot of young people. I don't want to discourage you, Axel. But I found that a lot of young Latino youth of North Carolina, even rural North Carolina, are not as connected to sort of that feeling. I think because I was all by myself and all alone, I sort of overcompensated later on in my life, really wanting to connect with those roots, those raíces, right? Through my education, right? As far as studying Mexican history, studying abroad in Mexico, right? I really wanted to learn all about myself. And I did so much of that through my own academic work and in my sort of my personal work in the community. And I found that a lot of young people in North Carolina, like my cousins, for example, right, sort of described themselves, talked about themselves as Hispanics, and I would never use that word in my own research, right? Or call myself by that name at all. And also just seemed sort of very, only spoke English, very, very infrequently would they speak Spanish. But if they were speaking to their parents, yes, but among friends and things like that, never spoke Spanish. And so I always wondered, what about living in this rural place, how that had affected them, right? So I find that a lot of young people are sort of missing that sort of point of reference of like, Latinidad is powerful and important and badass, right? Like it is such an amazing sort of identity and culture across Latinx populations. And I feel like for some young people, it's missing.
Yeah. Our conversations, our first episode starts with Perla Guerrero's work, and her personal experience and her breakdown of kind of like how race comes into play in a lot of these things, but also kind of we talked about this piece where there's like a gap or a missed opportunity in trying to bring in the concept of like Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx into a space like the South, where you have these younger generations, which you're referencing, that could really identify with kind of that like empowerment aspect of like, hey, soy de aquí, I was born here, but I still have this history. And that's what you're describing there is it's essentially kind of part of her argument in this missed opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting because I myself have never necessarily identified as being Chicana.
Yeah.
Because I also had no idea what the word meant until I went to college, right? Like I was legit by myself trying to navigate the world as Judy, right? And so messed up in so many ways. And so when I went to college and like I learned what it meant to be Chicano and like, you know, that we're like from Aztlan and the Lost Land and all these things, right? Like I didn't even take a Chicano studies class, but I took classes in like American studies that were based on, you know, like Chicano theory and stuff. And I was like, well, I know where I'm from though. Like I know, like I grew up going to Mexico every year, right? Gracias a Dios, like I had that opportunity and so did my parents. And I knew exactly where we were from, right? And I knew all of the stories of mi gente and, you know, dating to the revolution and before. And so I'm like, I know exactly where I'm from. I know I'm not, you know, from the Southwest. I never sort of romanticized that part of the identity, right? I think it was much later when I realized that Chicano isn't just sort of like, you know, this lost land or whatever, but it's a political identity, right? A political identity that where strength resides to sort of identify as Chicano, Chicana, and with that mobilize. And, you know, once I learned about the Chicano movement, it's my favorite thing to teach, right, to the students, because it's like their eyes light up. Mm-hmm. And they realize how powerful our people have been in this country for generations, right? For decades. And it's really my favorite thing to teach are the movements of the 60s and 70s for the students. And it's like in that part of the identity, I totally hear that, right? I totally feel like, hell yeah, I'm a Chicana, right? Hell yeah, I am. But then I'm like, I'm also Mexican and Mexicana and I'm from Durango and all these things, you know? I'm like, we can have these nuanced, multi-layered identities, right? It's not like we can just be one thing or whatever. So I think, you know, young people would also benefit from recognizing that they don't have to, you know, intersectionality and intersectional identities are very real and very powerful and have different effects on our lives.
I think the difficulty is, and I think your point on like this nuance and intersectionality is great because to some extent, right, and Perla talks about this, is that even inputting status into this, or whether you actually were born into the US, yet having a level of engagement, like civic engagement, despite not having like the US born identity, like brings a new lens to like kind of this political identity or historical identity. And I guess from all that we've been discussing, the thing that touches with this project of Nuestro South is we're hoping to mitigate some of this like start from scratch type of history that a lot of youth grew up in typically rural or majority white or black white spaces, because that, like you said, there's generations of work, and this is something that I started with essentially with this project when I started reading some of the history from Julie, you know, talking to other people. Now I'm like talking to scholars like you that have like, you know, been documenting some of this, but there's generations of children and even parents themselves who maybe recently arrived that aren't aware of the established and somewhat even deep roots that already exist.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, it would, even when my students here that are from Chicago, right? A city that has been, you know, the most sort of populated city of Mexicans outside of the Southwest, right? But a city that since the early 20th century was known for its Mexican population. So many of my students don't know these stories, right? So they get to my class and are mad that they didn't learn about their history K through 12, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, hell yeah, you should be mad, right? We need to be mad. And that's part of it, right? Is also changing the curriculum. I mean, I don't know what your history classes were like, Axel, but in Wisconsin, I think there was like a paragraph of the Chicano movement in my US history book, my AP US history class that I took. A paragraph. And that was like in an advanced history course, right? Like in the other ones, there was nothing about us, right? Maybe there was stuff on Cesar Chavez, but I feel like that's it. You know, Dolores Huerta came way in college, right? All of these, you know, so yeah, I think part of that is we need to think also about the way that, especially the students in K through 12, are growing up and seeing themselves. I think part of, you say this, there's a missed opportunity for that, but I think it's not necessarily our fault. It's that so much of the education system ignores the contributions of Mexican Americans, of Latinos in this country. And so when they learn US history in class, right, or when they're doing social studies, they don't learn about our social studies, right? And so they see everything still very black and white. And it's hard to find yourself in that narrative, right? It's hard to position yourself there.
Certainly. And, if anything, I think one of the challenges that where this information is available is not something that's necessarily accessible, because you tend to require a degree and get to college, which is why it's important to have folks like you in programs like this. And what we're trying to do is to provide it to folks in a more accessible way, right? And so I want to get into some of this work that you have done, into some of these stories, this history. And you referenced it a little bit earlier, but your work has this focus on looking at immigrant indigenous communities. So can you introduce like how that started and what community specifically you focused on?
So I was first introduced to the community from Cherán, Michoacán in Mexico through my organizing work. When I moved to Durham to start graduate school, the very same week that I moved there to start my studies, I also started volunteering at this organization that was in Old North Durham called El Quilombo. And El Quilombo used to serve the predominantly working class communities that surrounded the organization. And it was primarily Black and Latino families that lived in sort of like low-income housing and things like that. And so I would go, and it was a really nice community space that on Fridays had dinners that community members would make. And the rest of the week, we would have homework help for students. There were computers there for families that didn't have computer access or internet access. Oftentimes I did translating services. It was kind of a mixed bag, right? We were there. And in the summer, we did a lot of programming for the youth. So we did a lot of working on theater of the oppressed and things like that to sort of help students navigate a bunch of things that they were experiencing really young, right? Like encounters with police officers, right? As young as 8, 9, 10 years old. So one day when I was in that community space of El Quilombo, I was watching a woman sitting at a computer screen, and she was watching YouTube videos of what to me looked like a guerra, like a war. And I was like, I like to say that I'm not chismosa. I was not being chismosa, but I am very, I'm an Aquarius, I'm an extrovert, and I like to make conversation with people that used to come into the community space, right? Especially so that they feel welcome and know that we're there for them, right? And I asked the woman, like, oh, like, what are you watching? What is that? And she had her child in her arms. She's like, oh, well, this, like, I'm watching, this is a live feed this is a video from my community in Mexico. And I'm like, what's going on? I'm like, I'm not seeing this in the news or whatever. She's like, no, well, my community is an indigenous community and they're in an uprising. It was 2011. They're in an uprising against the narco and political state. And I was like, what? Like, I feel like I didn't know any of those words. I was like, I knew what narcos were, but I didn't. I'm like, an indigenous community? I mean, that's how wrong I was, right? In terms of thinking about indigeneity as sort of a lost relic of Mexican history, right? This thing that we celebrate sort of like el 16 de septiembre, with our Aztec things and our dancers and stuff, but not really like an indigenous community still living and still identifying as indigenous. And so that just blew my mind. And that was sort of that first moment, right? That I met folks from Cheran. Then once at Duke, I was at an art exhibit, and it was featuring a local artist by the name of Cornelio Campos, who is from Cheran. And I started, I went and I talked to the artist, again, being chismosa, no, but I talked to him and and I was like, oh, when I learned he was from Cheran, I told him that I had met other people from his community in my organizing space. And he was like, yeah, you should come. We have this celebration in October. It's in a couple of weeks. You should come to it. It's the celebration of our Saint Day festival. He's like, you feel like you're in Mexico when you're there. And I was like, dope, I'm in, I'm going, So I feel like all those, both in my academic life when I was a grad student and then outside in the world doing my organizing work, I met people from Cheran. I don't want to be corny, but I'm like, I was meant to do this work because, in both of my lives, like they kind of came together in that. And then I met folks from Cheran. Cornelio connected me with other community members, and I ended up, driving from Durham to places like Middlesex, North Carolina, and Zebulon, North Carolina, and Raleigh and Fuquay Varina, and all of these places, interviewing and meeting people from Cheran and their life stories. And then I thought I should just make a job out of this. I should make my project based on this. This is what I love to learn about, right? And as I learned more about that community's uprising a través de los años, right, I thought about all the ways in which their organizing of their community could be lessons for us as organizers and immigrant rights movements in North Carolina, and how much we could borrow and learn from them. And I went to Mexico because I met their families from North Carolina, connected me to their family in Cheran. And so I went and I stayed at their houses. I lived with them. I had breakfast with them, had dinner with them, went to bailes with them, went to bodas with them, right? I became an ethnographer sin querer queriendo. And it was so revelatory for me, right? As a baby organizer, to sort of see how a community organizes, right? And how they do so, particularly through this identity of being indigenous and resisting external encroachment, resisting the tala de los árboles, right? The destruction of their forests and the narcos, right? From coming into their community. I was just blown away. I mean, I think so much of my work as it was happening was just that I was amazed by these people all the time. And I just wanted to learn more and more.
Such a wonderful experience, because I think, one, it adds layers to it. I think in previous conversations, what we've discussed is, these broad strokes that the South gets painted with that, exclude people, make them invisible, and then sometimes perpetuate this idea that it's like the South's fault for having X amount of issues, while there's so many people doing good work within it.
Yeah.
But then we're adding this layer of this like transnational indigenous community who maybe in Mexico as well, or even on our own understanding history of like what Latin America is or what communities exist there, are also doing amazing work, transformative work that, in terms of organizing or in terms of political movements, should maybe be a part of the main discourse that we're having, right?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I mean, I was drawn to the story because like communities in LA during 2006 had organized when the teachers in Oaxaca were on strike, and there was this trans-border collective action taking place. And I was just really impressed with thinking about how this indigenous community in North Carolina, I mean, North Carolina, on top of being this immigrant sort of receiving state and its population sort of getting out of, sort of blowing everybody else out of the water in the 90s, right? With its boom in Latino population and its boom in immigrant population. Not only were there all these Latinos here, right? But there was this indigenous community that was arriving also in the 80s and 90s. And by 2011, were so organized that they could support their home community, right? That they could support their home community in this uprising against, these oppressive forces. So I was just blown away by how fast they got everything together. I felt like certainly in Wisconsin, that's not the case for us. And so many other communities, right, are not as organized. That's just plain and simple, right? They're just not as organized. And I just thought it was beautiful the way that this community had come together for that.
You've referenced that, you attended some of these events, and then you write a little bit about the history of how this came to be, how it came to be organized, and eventually they were, running events and supporting their community in a very political and economic manner. So what were these events like? Can you describe what setting were they being held at? Because I saw one of the videos and I'm like, this is like a park somewhere, it seems, but I wasn't sure what town, and what did it encompass? What did they do?
Yeah, so I think the video that you're referencing is the celebration of their Saint Day festival. And they have it in Wendell, North Carolina. It's probably about an hour away from Durham. It's a little outside of Raleigh. It's like 15 minutes outside of Raleigh. And it's in a big campo. I mean, it's not in the little town, right? The little town is like a tiny little, cute little quintessential rural North Carolina town, predominantly white population. But in las afueras, they have these sort of campos that they rent out, and they have bull riding pens, and it's also just a big wide open space, and that would have nothing, right? Monday through Friday. And yet on this weekend, right, they had a bunch of vendors that were there. We got there really early. My videographer and I got there really early, and all of the people that were there were basically those only from Cheran. Usually by the end of the night, because there's bailes and comida and all this stuff, it attracts a lot of Latinos, Mexicans and others, right? Like Puerto Ricans, Colombians. Pero in the morning, it was really only the Cherani community. And, the women were handing out arroz con leche, and they were handing out pan for everyone for free. And I was like, what? And, everybody was taking care of everybody. The little girls were getting ready in their traje típico. And so there were moms there doing the trenzas with the beautiful colored ribbon. The men were kind of seeing that the stage where the musicians were going to be playing later was all set. They had porta potties ready. There were people at the door, because people from Cheran can come in sort of for free into the space, but because they do collect about $30,000 to host this event every year, they do try to make a little bit of that money back, by charging folks that are not from Cheran to enjoy the space. So to enjoy the baile. But I mean, they've had really big regional Mexican groups come and play. So Conjunto Primavera, so then that they're able to start a little money coquito for next year, right? So that the organizers in the following year can do it. And so in the morning, there's this small peregrinación with a Catholic priest that who celebrates Mass in Butner, North Carolina. And it's a beautiful sort of ceremony with ofrendas to the priests. It's lovely. And then people, again, will continue to eat the rest of the day. There are people selling artesanías. I mean, it's like you're in a little pop-up makeshift market, un mercadito, right? With amazing food and music throughout the day, little kids running around. It's lovely. It is like you're transported, especially for me that I'm from the desert in Mexico, right? Northern Mexico is sierra everywhere. It's puro cerro. And so to be running around in unpaved roads and in this space in the campo that really took me back for sure, also to Mexico. So I understood a lot more of what sort of Cornelio had said, right? You feel like you're in Mexico when you're in this space. It's like a bubble.
some of the references that a few folks in the videos were talking is like, como si estuviéramos en el pueblo, or the sense of like, but there's also this sense of like generational importance for events like this. Even for someone like you're referencing that like, hey, this is important to see. As an adult, imagine like being a child that is growing up with this, as like maybe maybe you have no one in high school, or you have maybe less, but when you have this congregation of community, it's like, oh yeah, this is my crew.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate it so much, right? That the children are there and they're a part of it, all of the organizing too. They're seeing their parents take on these leadership roles of organizing the celebration, especially because so many of them don't have the opportunity to go to Mexico until usually they're much older, right? Because maybe their parents can't go with them, so they wait until maybe they're a little bit older, a little bit grown, so that like a tío can take them, or they can fly by themselves, right? Or take the el camión by themselves. So a lot of them don't really get to experience what Cheran is like until they're much older. And being able to have these celebrations and these festivals here in North Carolina, at least until they can go to Cheran, go visit their grandmothers and go meet the rest of their family, I think is really important for the parents. It's very important to instill in them this sort of this pride and orgullo of being indígena and having these costumbres.
So that's kind of what kind of takes me to this broad question that and topic that I've been exploring, that I think I started this series of conversations with this like distinction of poder y cultura, but if anything, there's the more interesting part is the intersection of them, because like you're saying, maybe in terms of like political power or economic power, it seems like it seems so difficult to attain that when you're dispersed, when you're a newcomer, when you're an immigrant. But when you have these like rallying calls of culture or religion, things just seem to click and fall into place, and you have communities like these that are able to mobilize.
Right. Yeah, and I think so much of what was amazing to me about this community was that they don't only reside in Durham, right? A lot of them do. A lot of them do live in Durham, in the city, right? But a lot of folks, like I said, I was driving around, rural parts of North Carolina trying to find their houses, right? And, and especially those that lived in these more rural areas of North Carolina were practicing a lot of the same things that they did in Mexico, that they did in Cheran. So they had like outdoor fire pits where they cooked, because that's how they would cook in Cheran. Montaban a caballo, because that's what they would do in Cheran, right? They, now there's a community, from Cheran that's very engaged in like bull riding in North Carolina. There is a young man that's made a name for himself in the Latino bull riding community in North Carolina that is from Cheran. But because in Cheran there's this huge bull, like I had never been to like a bull, yo ni sé cómo se dice, like a bull riding thing, un jaripeo. I had never been to a jaripeo like that, where there were actually like bulls and things. And the first one that I went to was in Cheran, and it's like this big thing that people go to and enjoy. And now the Cherani community has replicated that in North Carolina, so it's fascinating to me, really, the way in which this community se ha como desenvuelto, that they've made North Carolina their home, and are continuing to replicate their costumbres y tradiciones the way that they would if they were back in Cheran.
Yeah, they're continuously shaping and transforming North Carolina to their image, just as much as this context of the South shapes your own circumstances. Yeah. Exactly. That's a great point. And so I want to transition a bit to, it's in conjunction because there's religious aspects to what we've been talking already, but you write a piece that touches a little bit on religion and another space of community building, and also tension, which is like the Catholic Church, and how they came to start serving the Latinx or immigrant community at a time where a lot of demographic shifts were happening. So tell me a little bit about this kind of history or story with the Catholic Church here in Durham. The Holy Cross, I believe, is the name. And what can you say about that history?
Yeah, that was such a fun history for me to learn, as someone who, when they arrived in Durham, sought out a Spanish-speaking church for Spanish-speaking mass and started attending Immaculate Conception without ever knowing the history of the Latino community's sort of arrival there. And as a graduate student, I had a graduate professor who, when I told her that I went to mass at Immaculate Conception, was like, "Oh, did you ever learn about or hear about the walkout from the walkout that the Latino community had?" And it was like this big scandalous story that she shared with me. And I was like, "No, I have never heard about that." She's like, "Yeah, you should look it up." And so that's what I did, right? I started looking it up, and the Latino community in Durham was growing by the 80s. And in 1986, two sort of representatives of the Spanish-speaking community approached a priest and asked this priest if he would consider celebrating a bilingual mass to serve like this growing Latino community that was really yearning to have a space where they could practice their faith in the language that they practice their faith in Espanol. And the priest agreed, but the caveat was that the church where the priest celebrated was a historically Black Catholic church. Not to go into a big rabbit hole of sort of Catholics and Black Catholics, but Catholicism in general in the US South, prior to Latinos immigrating and settling there, and a lot, of course, migration from parts of the North, Catholicism was not even a thing. It's like absurd to think, right, in sort of the Mecca of sort of the Bible Belt Protestant, South, that Catholics would ever reign as powerful as they came to reign. And then, let alone, then you have the sort of the added piece of being Black and Catholic in the US South, which even more minoritized identity, right? Because most Black folks in the South are sort of believed to be of the Protestant faith, right? And so Latinos came and asked a priest in this historically Black Catholic church to celebrate a bilingual mass. And the priest said, "Cool, like, I'll do it," right? His Spanish at that point was not great, but he managed, right? He had spent time celebrating bilingual masses in sort of his education in New York. And so he was like, "Yeah, I can do it," and of course it got better. And so that continued for like 6 years. He eventually leaves this Black Catholic church and a new priest arrives. Now, this new priest doesn't speak Spanish, and the community, the Black community of the Church of Holy Cross, was like, "You know what? This is a Black Catholic church. We don't want to lose our identity. We fought so hard to sort of remain a Black Catholic church, even through the integration of churches, which essentially erased all of the Black Catholic churches from North Carolina's landscape." So they said, we fought so hard for this to be this kind of a church. We really want to sort of end this bilingual mass and create sort of one community only in English. And so the priest is like, "Yeah." I mean, he didn't know anything. He didn't know anything about what had happened previously. He also didn't know how to speak Spanish, right? So it was like, "Yeah, I mean, I can't celebrate bilingual masses anyway." Right. He's like, "Both of these things make a lot of sense to me." So, the protagonists of this story, the women who sort of started the Spanish masses, or the women who at least had advocated for the Spanish masses, right, caught wind of this news that their Spanish mass was going to end. And there was a priest that, again, in the in the time when the Spanish-speaking priest had left, they had brought in another sort of retired priest who did speak Spanish to do the bilingual masses. He was a little bit of an instigator, as it turns out. And while a lot of people believe that the Latino community spearheaded this sort of public presence of cameras and journalists, it wasn't really them. It was probably this instigating priest. And so, again, the Latino community caught wind that this was going to happen, that their bilingual mass was going to be terminated. And they discussed at their sort of nightly rosary what to do as a community. And they decided that what they could do, right, having sort of little power, and the church wasn't theirs. I mean, they were visitors in this space. What the only thing they could do really was walk out, right? Like just walk out when they said that. Like, and there wasn't really much discussion after that. There was no sort of planning or like, okay, first, you know, Sonia's gonna walk out first, and then like there was none of that. They're just like, we'll walk out, and that's it. Of course, that Sunday in October, October 13th, when they walk out, by the time they walk out, you know, and they're carrying their statue of La Virgen that they had purchased and put in the church, when they walk out, there are photographers there waiting for them, and there are journalists waiting to interview them. And they're like, who told them? who made this choice, right? So they were kind of taken aback because they hadn't originally intended for it to become a thing, right? They hadn't envisioned it to become, they did want to be heard, right? They did want the church especially to recognize that they wanted a space, especially the diocese of Raleigh. They wanted them to know that they needed a space. They didn't really intend for it to become this story that ended up being a national story, right? It was in headlines across the country. And so they were really taken aback because people began using this story as one that proved that Latino and Black cultures collided. That they clashed. That in spaces where Latinos and Blacks would confront themselves, there would be conflict, right? There would be these sort of confrontations. And that's how the story has been sort of continually narrated. And yet what is ignored really is that a lot of the Latino community itself had and have no idea, not only of sort of the history of Blacks in the US South, but also have no idea of the history of Black Catholics in the US South, much less of Holy Cross as a church, right? There was no understanding of that. There was also no understanding of really of the Black community and the sort of limitations that Latino community had with regard to sort of language, their own sort of endeavors to come into this country, and sort of this idea of why couldn't they just learn English, right? And sort of enjoy Mass in English. So there was some missed opportunities there, right? To sort of really grow as one community. But what I sort of argue is that what is also predominantly ignored of these stories is that the Catholic Church has been a white institution since its inception. And the fact that, you know, this clash, quote unquote, happened in Durham reveals much more about sort of the white supremacy of the Catholic Church in the US South than it does about either of these two communities coming head to head with each other, right? Because they weren't serving the needs of the Latino community. And, you know, they're the ones that had failed the Black community after integration. And so there was no need for, there was no space for the Catholic Church to be trusted, really, right? To sort of have the best interests of these two communities at heart. And so I think, you know, when we think about the US South, we think about these sort of minoritized communities, these racialized communities, but we ignore the way that whiteness has been so central to the marginal positions of these communities.
What I find so interesting and it touches to this point of like what the default power or is in the South is that in most situations, and these folks who maybe didn't want things to be so public, but just wanted to be heard within their community or institution, in most situations, whether it's political or economic, like, tranquilo, like, let me just keep a low profile. But it's so interesting how in this like religious space or institution, there seemed to be an awareness from this religious community of like immigrant Catholics of what rights or what representation or what inclusion meant, and what making demands was like, right? Which is not something that I, over my time here or seeing my parents, it's not something that I see in the workplace, right? Even within immigrant like own workplaces, it's not something I see in terms of like even education, going and advocating for your children. But in places that have this cultural aspect, like a religious institution, they feel that, right? So what do you think about that?
I make of that it's really sort of this sense of ownership of being sort of a Latino Catholic and a Mexican Catholic, and what that means in our culture, right? And I think it is this sense of ownership or propriety or sort of the most fundamental basic right that people have. And it's so great how you posit that, right? That we don't see this type of organizing or this level of organizing in like places of labor usually, right? Or at least there's much more hesitance to do that, right? Or there's even maybe a stronger fear of like advocating for your children, or maybe how do I advocate for my children in a space, right? When I don't speak, English, or all these other limitations, right? But how they went about that in a church, right? Where you sense this feeling of ownership, this feeling of this belongs to me too, right? Maybe nothing else in this place, in this, in the United States belongs to me, but God and this space to worship and be in community does, right? I have a right to be here, and I have a right to listen to mass in my language. And I think a lot of it comes from, again, the experience of Catholicism in Mexico, and how it is such a communal thing, a communal experience, in the sense of so much of local towns revolve around Catholicism. As much as anybody wants to say that Mexico is a secular state, but also like Mexicanos get 2 weeks off for Holy Week, right? No one works during that time. El Día 12 de Diciembre is broadcast, televised internationally, right? Like, so yeah, it's a secular state, but Catholicism is a very cultural Mexican experience in a very particular way that Mexicanos celebrate it, right? And I think for that reason, this sense of ownership, this sense of this is ours and we're going to fight for this space, happens in places like in Durham, right? When they feel like other people are trying to take it from them. And I think that you're right. It really doesn't. We don't really see that as aggressively in other instances of sort of social life for Latino immigrants.
Yeah.
And I really didn't think, to be honest, that I would ever do a history that involved so much about religion or Catholicism, right? That was not what I ended up. That was never in sort of my research agenda, was to study religion, or at least how religion culturally affects immigrant communities. But then I realized that so much of the social organizing, of the political work, was actually happening in faith-based spaces, right? Happening in the Catholic Church. There's no way to ignore that, right? And so you have to delve into the political intricacies of the church itself, and of the way that communities make local churches so different, right? Transform local churches in ways that don't even reflect the institution of the Catholic Church.
A peer on campus, she did some of her work on just how religion also kind of has defined some of the boundaries of how immigrants are perceived as well, because in a sense you have sanctuary movements, and in another sense you have this like anti-immigrant, like evangelical like backlash as well, which is, like you said, intricacies and nuances of like all within like religious like doctrine, practices, ideologies, which are super interesting. I wanted to ask you, maybe tying back to a point, an important history that you were talking about, which is this like so-called tensions or really like gaps between the history that Latino immigrants knew about the Black US South and vice versa. One of the previous conversations about Mississippi plant workers, there's this project about trying to essentially kickstart this project where you have like a political education on like what it was to become a migrant and come into these spaces. Because a lot of times in work areas, like labor movements were basically co-opted by recruiting immigrant or undocumented labor to like replace the laborers who were trying to like strike or do something similar to unionize. And so like there's a lot of history, like, you know, in this case within church, but also within labor. How do you think the younger generations are navigating these instances where, you know, for example, for me, I'm not coming as like a naive, not necessarily naive, but uninformed immigrant who can't even speak the language and understand the history. I've been educated within the space. I've grown up within these communities. How do you think that generation is kind of maybe navigating some of these, like, I guess, negotiations between whether I'm siding with those who have been marginalized or taking the benefits and running with them?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I mean, Axel, I think so much of you and all of your other colleagues that have really taken advantage of the opportunities that have been afforded to you, right? I think young people, especially in places like Durham, when they are so exposed to organizing, have really grown up recognizing that the community supports each other, right? And I think about all the work of my organizing homies, right, that have supported sort of sanctuary movements, that have supported work against 287G in communities and all of that. You're surrounded by these avisos all the time, right? Or all of the local sort of movements of so-and-so was detained, we need to call, we need to get him out of detention, right? And I think of the work of people like Ivan Almonte, of Vidi, of all of the things they've done to support people that have been in immigrant detention and they managed to get out because of the organizing, right? And all of the work they did back in the day for when the DREAM Act was coming to Congress, right? So I think that those people and sort of their public presence in North Carolina is sort of active, especially as being young people themselves, right? Being young people themselves that have for like decades been doing this work. I think they've really set an example for a lot of the youth, especially those of you that grew up sort of seeing them and listening to them, right? Yeah. Even if you were too young to understand or to necessarily get involved, right? I think that in a lot of ways, you know, being in that environment encourages you to get involved, right? And so when we started talking about sanctuary on Duke's campus, right? Y'all went and ran with that idea, right? And did so much for your undergraduate experience at Duke and living as Durhamites, right? And so I think that being in an environment where that is so prevalent among the Latino community mattered. I think it mattered a whole lot.
Yeah, and I can speak to even just I was at Alamance County before, like in middle school, and then like my transition, just my years in high school in a place like this, not only made like, because the community was more supportive in general, made my family more comfortable, right, less like direct law enforcement bearing down on us, but then also like I ended up having certain opportunities to engage in a way that other youth maybe in more remote settings wouldn't have.
Right. So, and we know how Alamance County is changing already, right? With my friend Ricky Hurtado being, you know, representing Alamance County now in the North Carolina House of Representatives. I mean, it's wild. It's a transformative experience to sort of be watching that. And I mean, I can't imagine you that actually grew up in that space, But I mean, even like for me driving around Alamance County, right, and to know that now this, you know, the son of Salvadoran immigrants is representing this county is like mind blowing, right? It's like, wow, orale. Like North Carolina, people have said, right, for a long time in these, especially in these last 2 elections, is a really important key player. And I think it's only going, like, the state's importance in future political transformations is yet to be seen, right? I mean, we need to sit back and just watch what North Carolinians are doing, because it is really powerful. It's really powerful.
Yeah, it's a very hopeful point of view, and I'm on that boat as well. The ones who are here just need to keep doing the work. I want to ask you a question to maybe based on your work, to maybe inform some of those individuals who are now active and like seeking to maintain themselves engaged. That touches back to where we started with this Latinidad and indigeneity, and how you learn organizing yourself. You know, Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, all those are painted with wide brushes, right? It's there's no nuance or like breakdown on those, but we know that there's a lot more to it. The South is painted with a wide brush, and there's a lot more nuance to that. So what's a way, or how would you like maybe advise or give like young organizer or young individuals who are exploring this personal history and just general history of Latinos in the South to incorporate more of that history of indigenous communities, that history of like maybe indigenous teachings or like forms of organizing? Like what's a way to do that?
I think it's just to recognize that, you know, especially in the most recent iterations of Mexican migration and to be honest, just sort of Latino immigration to the United States, what we are seeing in the trends and the demographic trends is an increasing number of indigenous migrants and Afro-Latino migrants that are coming. And for a lot of reasons, sort of hadn't come precisely because of sort of the strength and power of indigenous communities, of the desire to be insular and not leave, you know, because they're even leaving their indigenous communities was sort of a point of contention, because they knew that once they left sort of the insularity, the safety bubble in which they resided, they were going to expose themselves to discrimination, right, from leaving their communities. And so the fact that a lot of communities, you know, in the 80s and 90s could no longer, you know, support themselves, resist the effects of global capitalism, right, and had to immigrate, were forced to immigrate, should allow us then to think about the difference in experience, should invite us, right, to think about the different in experience in terms of race and ethnicity, and even in language use. The majority of the community that I work with, the Purepecha from Cheran, only speak Spanish, right? They don't necessarily speak their indigenous language. There are a few, but most of them now continue to speak Spanish. And so just because they do speak Spanish, for example, does not mean that they are less indigenous than another community that does, right? It just means that it just points to the fact that for decades, the Cherani community has struggled against external encroachment, both from state, national, and international forces. And so it's hard to maintain a language when you're being, when you're on the guard, right, from external forces all the time. But I think it really should invite us to consider the ways in which those specificities of indigeneity, of Blackness, of language really affect the ways in which communities organize themselves and think of themselves, right? There are some communities, for example, that you won't be able to organize because you don't speak that language.
Yeah.
And so one of the most important parts, you know, facets of that is to recognize that not all Mexicanos or all Latinos speak Spanish, right?
Yeah.
Like point number one, right? Point number two is that some of these communities will will not trust people that are not from their communities, right? And again, long legacy of having very terrible experiences with outsiders because they have been discriminated against y sort of hecho de menos, right? Approach those communities not as people que son cerrados or are backward or whatever, but that they have a real reason to be wary of anybody that wants to sort of get into their life, right? I think also just as organizers in general to know that you don't know what communities need. And so to sort of jump in and say, here, I'm going to help you organize, I'm going to help you do this. You need to know what they want to do and what are sort of the traditional customs and practices that communities have for organizing and sort of learn from them. So many of the indigenous communities that live in Durham, you know, not just the Purépecha from Cheran, thinking of the Mixteco community, of the Otomi community, have very different cultural practices that you need to learn if you're going to communicate or work within them, right? There's some gendered issues. There's sort of, you know, some communities are very, you know, deferent, so they won't necessarily look you in the eye when they're talking to you. And you might think, oh, that's so rude or that's so weird, but that's just how these communities are, right? Like there's so many cultural cues of indigenous communities that I wouldn't say don't necessarily make them harder to organize or anything like that, right? But that we need to, you know, we assume sort of that all Latinos are like us or talk like us or
especially for younger generations, right?
Amen, right.
We're now like Americanized as well. And
you know, and we go up to someone that might look like us and we start talking to them and they're going to be like, okay, yeah, you know, or in a different language, right? And we don't know, we just assume that they speak Spanish and we're far off, right? There are so many young people that I know that speak their indigenous language and speak English, but don't speak Spanish because their parents don't speak Spanish, right? So they grow up learning their indigenous language and learning the English language in school. So there's a lot of nuance to that, right? And in a place like the US South too, you know, where these indigenous communities, you know, not only are confronting other Mexicanos, but are confronting Black Mexicans and reading them not as being Mexicanos, but as being like Black Southerners, right? Yeah. Like it is, those sort of interactions are sort of wild because these indigenous communities, again, because so many of them are sort of insular, they've never really engaged with sort of Blackness in Mexico and are realizing a whole other sort of minoritized experience in the US, right? And are learning about the nuances of race and what it means to be Mexican, right? So I think there's learning on both sides and we need to be ready to engage those differences and to listen, particularly. Take a back seat, learn as much as you can, and recognize that this homogenous idea of what a Latino immigrant is has to go out the window by now, right? Like if we didn't already smack it down before, we really need to erase that now, because when we think about the Latino immigrant community as this sort of homogenous, monolithic group, we miss a lot of the nuances of those migratory experiences, right? I mean, imagínate if it was hard for our parents because they didn't speak English, you know, but spoke Spanish. Think about the added, you know, the added sort of stress, pressure when you don't even speak Spanish, but you speak Maya, you speak Canjobal, you speak Otomi, you speak Purépecha, right? And you know, there are services for Spanish-speaking indigenous peoples or Spanish-speaking migrants, but not for you that are coming from the same nation, but don't speak that language, right? Yeah. So we need to think about the intricacies that sort of that posits for us as people that are working to serve and support immigrant communities.
And I've seen it firsthand working at schools that it's one thing now for, I think, across schools in North Carolina, you have a non-English speaking Spanish speaking student come in and there's somewhat of a process, somewhat of a system.
Yeah.
In places but more than others. But if you have an individual come in as a young immigrant to a school and it's not even Spanish that they speak, like all hell breaks loose. What do we do? And no, that is certainly an experience that is not only difficult, but definitely exists within states like North Carolina or across other parts of the South. So totally get that.
I think it's also sort of to say, to also not go in with the mentality that, oh, we need to teach them Spanish or they need to learn this, right? But to also emphasize that it is amazing to find communities, people that continue to speak their native languages, even after hundreds of years of colonialism, right? And racism and discrimination in places like Mexico, even in the US, right? When we think of our own native communities here, whose lands we've stolen, right? And so to consider, to sort of, when we meet these students, to not be like, oh, you don't speak Spanish, right? But to say like, oh my gosh, that is so cool that you speak this language.
Yes.
That would be great for all of us to learn a little bit about that, because again, there are going to be other Mexican students that are going to be like me, that are going to be like, what do they mean indigenous Mexicans, right? To show other people that like, there is so much to be learned about who we are, that we're just getting the tip of it, right? But and to not make these kids feel like they're like aliens or because they don't speak Spanish, to honor that and say, well, we're going to try to figure out different ways to engage with you, right? But a lot of them, again, is just sort of taking that hegemony of the Spanish language, right? The power that the Spanish language has, and recognize that, in Mexico, there are like 60 plus indigenous languages still spoken, pobres de nosotros that have lost that. But how cool for them, right? So I always feel like I was cheated, from not knowing my indigenous language.
I'm here. I'm like, yes, I still got the Spanish.
I know. I'm like, I feel so thankful that I can speak Spanish.
Apenas por lo menos tengo ese.
That's right. I feel the same, And so the fact that these kids sometimes speak both, I'm like, girl, amazing.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I'd love to start closing it, and I have a few questions I'd like for you to kind of just maybe reflect a little bit on. Given all that we've discussed, what's maybe one way that you've seen over the past couple decades that Latinos that you've worked with in North Carolina, the way they exercise their power has changed? Su poder.
Yeah, I think that the Latino community of North Carolina and its richness and vastness have really transformed the geographical landscape of the state, right? From Durham to Greenville to Charlotte to Greensboro, right? They've made their mark in these places. They've been entrepreneurs and have raised children and have sent children to college and have gotten involved to support the immigrant community. They've become politicized, right? And have run for public office. I think those things, right? If we think really in the short amount of time that Latinos have been in North Carolina, right? 30-ish years that they've lived, 40, I can do math, 40-ish years that the Latino community has lived there, right? And established roots. They have transformed the place. Y a veces ha sido, a golpes duros, right? It has not been an easy struggle to sort of, and I think that perdura, no, the struggle continues, but have created these spaces of home, not even just among the indigenous community that I work with, right? The Purepecha of Cheran, but so many other Latino communities have really created spaces of home. Central American brothers and sisters, right? That also have negocios, that are also, sending their kids to school, that are, working in construction and have their own compañías and all this stuff. They have really transformed North Carolina visibly, right? Visibly, that you can see storefront names and you can see, the flags and everything. And I think, for example, when we think of the history of Latinos in the US, and we think of places like the US Southwest, and how for so many of those communities and those experiences, it took hundreds of years for Mexican Americans to be able to succeed or sort of have ownership to a space because of histories of oppression and racism and discrimination. And of course, they certainly set the stage, right? The power of Latino communities in the US Southwest now, that experience, that whole history has certainly affected the way that on the other side of the country, the Latinos in the US South have been able to create these same spaces. Now,
Yeah.
I think North Carolina is very different than a place like Mississippi or Alabama, right? I think our brothers and sisters are still fighting different battles. And I think that's why North Carolina, to me, remains like this pillar of hope, right? Sometimes it's deep, deep sorrow, but sometimes it's also hope. And and it's a lot of orgullo to know that so much of the reason why North Carolina is the way it is because of the young people that have pushed forth for many years to make it so. And I think that's where we can really latch on to the hope, is in that power of the youth to move and organize and to learn and to get involved with projects like Nuestro South, right? When you're on your own journey of self-discovery in a lot of ways, right? And you're on that journey to educate others who, like you, grew up in this space. And once the young people take hold of that, whoosh, cállate, just get out of the way. You know what I mean? These TikToking youth are going to revolutionize the world. So me esmero, right? Like, I'm, as someone who studies history, right? And to know the experiences of Latinx communities in so many different places, right? From the Midwest to the US Southwest to the Northeast, even to a place like Florida, right? And then to see, the experience that, it's like a baby community when we think about it, right? 40 años in the span of history no es nada.
Yeah.
And to see what it has happened here, again, what has not happened in a place like Wisconsin, right? But has happened in North Carolina, is really special. And I think says a lot about the strength of communities supporting each other and learning, that even though there are certainly things that separate us and experiences that separate us, there's a lot more that unites us and brings us together.
That's great. And then besides like the festivals that you attended, what are some of your favorite ways that cultura or tradiciones are maintained within these communities?
Girl, I'm all about the food, right? The food is one of the most magical ways in which communities continue to sort of live out their tradiciones and costumbres, right? I mean, if you go and have pozole at one family's house, you're going to have a way different type of pozole at someone else's, right? Yeah. It's the Mexican cuisine and all of its richness, because of its regionalism, is probably the easiest way to encounter how people have maintained their tradiciones and costumbres.
Yeah.
But even in sort of their dress and their celebration of particular days, that like el 12 de diciembre, for example, which again continues to be a religious experience, but in a lot of ways it's also very cultural. It's very much, an experience of what Mexicanidad to a lot of people means.
Yeah.
And so I think language, food, the way they practice their religion, even in the way that people are, I think having lived in Mexico, both as an undergrad and as a grad student, there's something that you learn about life in Mexico that I would encourage all young people to sort of consider, is that people are very cálidos in Mexico. They run on a very different concept of time than we do in the US. Aquí es todo.
Yeah.
Like, time is money, and like the individual, and like capitalism and all this stuff that rules our lives, right? So much of our lives. In Mexico is bien diferente, right? If you're walking down the street in the city and, you run into a friend or something, you'll stop and talk to them. And if you're 30 minutes late to an appointment, ni modo, right? Like you were talking to your compadre. So there's something so beautiful about recognizing differences in the concept of time, differences in the way people engage and interact with each other, a real sort of sense of, it's not about the individual, but it's about the communal experience. Like mi bienestar is tied to the bienestar of my neighbor and of my paisano. I think those things I can see clearly in the community in North Carolina. And I think, not only just in my indigenous community, but I see it broadly as well. And I think that's what, to me, provides sort of this sense of home of North Carolina, is because in a lot of ways, I do feel like I'm in Mexico when I'm there, not only because I can eat everything that I want to eat, but because when I go to all these people's houses that I have grown up, I did grow up in a lot of ways, right? When I started grad school, that I came to know over the time, it is like I'm meeting my family. And there are so many people that I've encountered in Mexico that, again, no blood relation to me, but because of the way that they greet you, la calidez de la gente, that creates family, right? And I think that's my favorite part.
That's an amazing way. And I think that sense of community is incredibly important, not only to maintain your culture, your traditions, but also to survive many situations. And then last question to close it off, based on your experience or your work, what is something that currently represents this concept of Nuestro South?
I think the fact that of the ownership, right? I think I see a lot of ownership from the youth and from people about reclaiming space and reclaiming this sense of history that, we are from North Carolina, we are from the US South. Like Latinos in the US South are not an anomaly anymore, right? It's a very much we're generations in at this point, right? And so just this recognition that the US South and its history and its story cannot be told without a focus and a real attention to Latino communities. And I think that we can say that because Latinos who have lived there and resided there have made it a point to say, you cannot discount us, right? North Carolina experienced its, industrial boom in the 90s because we were here working in the factories. We were here building, Charlotte. We were here making these interstates. So none of, especially North Carolina's recent history, can be told without the Latino experience. Girl, even in the 60s and 70s, when there were farm workers, these were farm workers that were coming from Mexico and from other parts of the US South and laboring seasonally and going back, right? They might come all the way up from Florida and keep going north on the migratory route, but they were still making North Carolina's tobacco industry work, their textile industry work, right? So now that the Latino community is settled and really, transforming the geographic space, it's a sense of ownership and saying, we are here, we've been here, and we are the future of history in the US South.
There's one of the previous caller mentioned as a immigrant father was driving down one of the roads in Atlanta. He was like, I built that.
Amen.
I think it's a great way to finish. Professor Yuri Ramirez, thank you so much. This is an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much, Axel. It's been a pleasure.